I see a lot of people who are back for the third time now. That is a real sign of commitment and interest in this subject, and a special welcome to those who are here now for the first time today. Our theme for this third and final meeting of this seminar is Dietrich von Hildebrand as philosopher of the heart and of beauty. There are actually two parts here. His philosophy of the heart and his aesthetics, or philosophy of beauty, forms a second, final part of today's meeting. But I thought it might be good if, like last time, I open with a brief summary of the ground we covered in the last meeting. Those who are new to the seminar may get a little connection, and the recapitulation can't hurt for those who were here. So let me summarize it like this. Last time we saw that all moral philosophies connect the moral life with happiness, that is, with the real well-being of human persons. And of course, this real well-being is not to be identified with what von Hildebrand calls the merely subjectively satisfying. Now, some moral philosophies, as we saw, make the attainment of happiness the main point of the moral life. The distinctive thing about von Hildebrand's approach to the moral life is that this is a mistake. You can't make happiness the main point. A certain transcendence, self-transcendence proper to the moral life is lost. There's a love of good for its own sake that belongs to the moral life and has to be acknowledged. And this implies a certain priority of what von Hildebrand calls value response to the full flourishing of persons that we call happiness. So he wants to vindicate a certain moment of self-transcendence that's easily lost in affirming the connection of the moral life with happiness. And that I see as perhaps the main point of originality in his moral philosophy. Now, in the last meeting, we also had some interesting issues about value, the objectivity of value, how one knows value, and those questions can, of course, be revisited today in the discussion. Now, I said at the end of the last meeting that there's one other contribution of von Hildebrand to moral philosophy that I wanted to share with you before I go into today's new topic. And it is a contribution regarding the structure of moral evil. Let me put it like this. When you look at the account of moral evil in Western philosophy, beginning with Socrates, you a certain perennial temptation, one might say, to give an, I would call it, intellectualist account of moral evil. That is, to think of moral evil in terms of a mistake being made about what's really good. So one will say, in the morally bad action, a lower good is mistakenly preferred to a higher good. And therein lies the disorder that makes the action morally bad. And the reason for this, what I'm calling temptation to an intellectualist account, that is, to think of moral evil in terms of a mistake about what's really good, lies in this, that one wants to say the human will, by its very nature, is ordered to what is good. The will is made for good. It naturally responds to good. So even in the morally wayward will, one still thinks, well, the will is still, even at its worst, directed to good. So moral badness must lie in some mistake, some merely apparent good, or some wrongly chosen lower good. But what never sounds quite right is that these accounts of moral evil don't quite face up to the full reality of deliberate wrongdoing. That is, wrongdoing where you know what you do is wrong, where you can't appeal to some illusory good that has fascinated you and misled you, but where you do wrong in the full knowledge that what you do is wrong. That remains, well, von Hildebrand thought, insufficiently explained in many traditional accounts of moral evil. He would often point to the famous passage in the Confessions of St. Augustine, where Augustine describes the famous theft of the neighbor's pears. He lived next to a neighbor with a pear orchard, and he and his friends one evening wrecked the pear orchard, took all the pears, threw them away, had no interest really eating them. And so Augustine reflects, what was it that made me take such malicious delight in destroying my neighbor's property? And he says, well, was there something good there that I just wrongly pursued? No, he says, that doesn't sound right. I knew that this was wrong. And I even took a perverse delight in the very wrongness of it. So how does one, in one's philosophic reflection on such deliberate wrongdoing, how does one give a realistic account that doesn't sort of tend to bend the morally bad action back into some deception or illusion about what is really good? And this is where von Hildebrand's idea of what he calls our capacity for pursuing something as merely subjectively satisfying comes in as important. Remember, I brought that out in the last meeting, contrasting value response in von Hildebrand with his interest in something as merely subjectively satisfying. And as I say, not only is there a contrast with value response, but even what we call the interest in one's own happiness. That's something of a much morally more serious character than this interest in what just gratifies me. And so von Hildebrand wants to say that it can happen that the destruction of some good, as in the case of the young unconverted Augustine, still more a hoodlum than a saint, it can happen that one finds the destruction of good, the desecration of some good, subjectively satisfying. And in that case, one can be very clear about the fact, yes, I know this is wrong. I'm not deceived. I'm not taking this under the aspect of good. I know this is wrong, and yet I'm doing it all the same. And von Hildebrand tried to make sense of that in terms of this interest in the merely subjectively satisfying. That can take over and lead us to trample on things of acknowledged goodness, acknowledged worthiness. And so, with his view, the morally bad action isn't placed there in the intellect with some mistake about good, but it's placed resolutely in the will that perversely just doesn't care what's really good, and even finds some subjective satisfaction in the destruction of it. So I wanted just to mention that ancient problem, you might say, about the motivation of morally bad action, and what I take to be as a contribution of von Hildebrand to, let's say, preserving a full realism about the deliberate wrongdoing that we're all capable of. So perhaps that point is weighty enough to take some questions on it before we get into the real heart of today's meeting with von Hildebrand's philosophy of the heart. So, yes, please.
Just a point of clarification. Von Hildebrand wouldn't say that one actually wills anything evil. He wouldn't say that it's possible. It's even possible to will the evil.
No, but he does say it is possible to find evil, or the destruction of good, subjectively satisfying. To that extent, it can be willed, even in the knowledge that
so what's the connection between the will and, I guess, the subjective desire?
Yeah. Well, for von Hildebrand, you might say the most fundamental exercise of our moral freedom is this decision to turn to value and to venerate it, let ourselves and our action be measured by it, or to live for what's subjectively satisfying, in contempt of everything of value. And that, for him, is a kind of primordial moral choice that stands at the center of each moral life. So there's a fundamental freedom in turning to the good and willing to be judged by it and enlisted into the service of it, or turning away from it, holding it in contempt, and just asserting oneself and living by the merely subjectively satisfying. No choice that we make in the moral life is more fundamental than that in his vision.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed to me that you could describe the destruction of the pear tree as giving Augustine great power. Is that a subjective satisfaction?
Yeah.
We have the power to destroy
Yes.
the pears.
Yeah, it
Is
gave
that,
a
I
sense
mean,
of
I'm trying to
power.
connect between what I
Right.
think might have or could happen
Yeah.
and what you're describing it as.
Right.
Is that a subjective satisfaction?
Well, yeah, but Van Hildebrand would say, let's try the other kinds of good. Was it value? No, there was no value responding interest in power, because otherwise he wouldn't have been so glad to use it to destroy. Is the power thought of as objectively good for Augustine? And again, Van Hildebrand says, no, he's not really interested. There's a moment at which you so much don't care what's really good that you're not even really interested in what makes you really flourish and makes you truly happy. So he would say this interest in power was under the aspect of something merely subjectively satisfying. And as I say, that way of putting it puts the morally bad action very much in the will and the perversity of the will, and it avoids the temptation of thinking, well, intellect has been a little blinded and thereby misled into morally bad action. It's a disease of the will in the first place. Von Hildebrand holds, and he can somehow make sense of that by this idea of the merely subjectively satisfying as a way of being interested in something that is certainly not value response, but also not the interest in one's real well-being. Yes?
So Hildebrand argues that it's possible we have real cases of people willing certain actions not for the sake of the good, but for the sake of something else.
Yeah.
You said that the other alternatives do it for the sake of being subjectively satisfying.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, would he go so far as to say that people can act directly for the sake of evil, or bad, or wickedness?
Yeah. Well,
And I think Freud.
yeah, it's like Evan's question, I think. And so, Hildebrand says, no, evil understood evil isn't choosable, but evil understood as evil may well be somehow subjectively satisfying for me. And when it is, it becomes choosable. That is
Just
his
so I'm clear,
view.
is the feeling of power, let's say that was what he got,
Yeah.
St. Augustine got out of
Right.
restoring the breakfast. Would you describe that as a subjective satisfaction?
Von Hildebrand certainly would.
Yeah,
He-
or maybe
he would say
right.
there are three, if you ask about the motivation of Augustine, or of anybody in any set of circumstances, there are basically three options. There's the value point of view, the point of view of what's really objectively beneficial for a person, or the point of view of what's merely subjectively satisfying. And he would say it's quite incontestable that in this case of Augustine, it was the merely subjectively satisfying. The interesting thing about the passage is that Augustine reviews the possibility of certain objective goods and says, well, was that the thing that moved me? And he sets it all aside and ends with great perplexity about his motivation. All right. Not that we've exhausted that subject, but let's turn to our issue for today, and the first part of it, von Hildebrand as philosopher of the heart. Now here I link up with a part of my public lecture on Tuesday evening that some of you may have heard. Von Hildebrand thinks that the heart, by which he means the center of affective life in human persons, is in need of rehabilitation. He thinks that in the history of Western philosophy, the heart has been too often depreciated, not given its due. And in particular, he says that the dominant view in Western philosophy has been that man is distinguished above all the animals by two things, by his power of intellectual understanding and his power of free will. And von Hildebrand then presses the question, well, if we've got these two powers of understanding and free will, where do we place the deepest stirrings of the human heart? So, for instance, what do we make of the grief that consumes King Lear when his daughter Cordelia dies at the end? Or where do we place the joy of parents at the birth of a child? This grief and this joy, these affective experiences, are not just intellectual understandings, but they're also not just acts of the will either. Their affective character makes them something different. Now, Hildebrand thinks that the tendency in Western philosophy has been, when one thinks about affectivity and sees that it's neither intellect or will or the two together, the tendency has been to think that, well, our affectivity is a kind of unruly appetitive energy that comes out of the body. And it's very human, this appetitive side, this affectivity, but at first it is unruly and disordered, and it's the work of the intellect and will to govern in an orderly way our affectivity. And so on this view, it remains the case, the heart as the center of affectivity is still something quite subordinate to intellect and will. Now, the position of von Hildebrand is that there's something reductionist going on here, to go back to our first meeting where we talked about the danger of reductionism in philosophy and how characteristic it is for him as phenomenologist to resist reductionism. There's something reductionist going on here. He wants to say certain affective experiences really are the full equal of intellect and will. They are just as eminent an expression of the human person as some act of intellectual understanding or some act of free will. So the grief of Lear, say, the joy of the new parent, these are acts of the person that are neither intellect, neither will, but they're also not something bodily from below. We really ought to think, what Hildebrand says, of there being in the human person not two main centers of properly personal life, namely intellect and will. We should think of three: intellect, will, and heart. That is a more adequate view of the human person, he argues. And though he owes a great deal to his teacher, Max Scheler, there's a great deal of original thought of his own in this rehabilitation of the heart. Let me gather from various writings of von Hildebrand 4 reasons why the heart has its own, you might say, properly personal dignity. It's not as if it's somehow fundamentally lower with intellect and will ordering some bodily appetitive energy. So 4 reasons that, taken all together for von Hildebrand, are supposed to rehabilitate affectivity and show that it really is as much, certain forms of affective life, as much the signature of the person, as expressive of man as person, as intellect or will. Now, he argues first that many affective experiences are motivated. That is, they're based on something understood. You see, Lear understands that his daughter is dead, and understanding that grieves. Or the parents understand that their child has been born and rejoice over what they understand. So many affective experiences are motivated based on some understanding. And that already imparts a certain personal dignity to them. Now, admittedly, von Hildebrand says there are plenty of affective experiences that are not really motivated. For instance, the euphoria caused by alcohol. It's not motivated. The euphoria is not about something. It doesn't have a motivating object. It's simply cause. It has natural causes. And so depression too can have its own natural causes and not be motivated by any understood sorrow. So there is in the affective life forms of affectivity that are undeniably caused, and being caused, they exist at a lower level, you might say, in the makeup of the human person. But there are also many an affective experience which are motivated, based on something understood about good and bad. Those motivated affective experiences have something distinctively personal about them. See, Hildebrand, following the phenomenologists, distinguish very much between what we undergo as a result of natural causes, and what motivates us on the basis of what we understand. And clearly you're into the real life of the person only with that motivated kind of acting. So that's the first thought that often occurs in his writings as he goes about this work of rehabilitating our affective life. And here's a second one. He argues that a deep, ardent, affective response is not only motivated, but also motivated by some perceived value. It is therefore a value response. And for all its affective ardor, still has, you might say, that meaningfulness or rationality of what of any value response. So, for instance, that delight of the parents in the birth of their child, is in part a value response. There's some perceived value in this new human being of which they are the parents. And that perceived value gives rise to, you could say, it engenders the delight, the grateful delight of the parents, the grateful delight, an intense affective experience. But the affectivity is not only motivated, it has the form of value response. And therefore, all of the self-transcendence of value response that we've talked about is found here right at the heart of these affective experiences. So, there's actually a point that I'll break for some questions on this. There's a point about value that I made last time that ought to be made again here when we talk about the heart and the possibility, you might say, of value responding acts of the heart. You remember when I mentioned value, this inner worth or dignity of a thing? And I said for von Hildebrand, everything of value gives off some beauty. There is this splendor or radiance proper to everything of value. And we typically call that splendor the beauty of a thing. Now, the beauty is significant because it is precisely something that fills us with delight when we experience. Very strange to have a purely intellectual apprehension of something beautiful, but it affects us and fills us with delight through its beauty. And so, for von Hildebrand, these value-responding affections that he focuses on, they've got their basis in the beauty given off by value, this radiance of beauty that everything of value has. So I think one ought to match up his thought about value and beauty on the one hand, and this capacity of the heart to give a value response, an affectively ardent value response. It's always some glimpse of the beauty of that which one responds to that makes that kind of affection possible. All right, so those are two thoughts. Now, bear in mind that von Hildebrand is not here to say that there are not plenty of very disordered affective experiences. There's hysteria, there's sentimentality, there's this uncontrolled rage, there's all kinds of disordered affectivity. He's not denying that obvious fact. But he wants to say there's also a region of affective life that has this inner order, being motivated by something understood, and even, in some cases, being motivated by a perceived value. And such affections are cut from another cloth and have to be appreciated in the eminently personal character that they have. Yeah, so there's something here to discuss, if only to keep me from talking too long without interruption. I'll go ahead and raise it now. All right. Yes, Brad, you have something.
I'm wondering about this. It seems pretty easy to see the legacy from von Hildebrand back to Shaler, but then even back to people like Pascal and of course, then Augustine.
Yeah.
And one of the things you've been stressing is this relationship between the will and the emotions.
Yeah.
But Pascal and it's just, I mean, the intellect relation.
Yes.
Between the heart and the emotion.
Yeah.
I'm wondering maybe you talk about that. And maybe what maybe von Hildebrand would say to kind of the famous adage, the famous thought of Pascal.
Yeah.
Heart is reasons, the reasons
Yeah.
do not know.
Yeah.
There's this kind of unreachable level of the heart that maybe the intellect itself cannot even.
Yeah, no, that thought of Pascal about the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing, is very congenial to him. You mentioned Augustine, and this is part of what's behind the Augustinian stamp of Hildebrand's whole philosophy. He saw in Augustine a forerunner of his own philosophy of the heart and of affectivity. There's that passage in the City of God of Augustine where he's in debate with the Stoics, with their famous ideal of apathy, of remaining indifferent in the face of all the blows that life delivers. And Augustine, against the Stoics, says, no, a fully alive human being has strong affections, and you somehow neuter the human being. You produce a cripple if you, in the name of Stoic apathy, try to kill all strong affectivity. So in those and other passages, Augustine seems to look toward that rehabilitation of the heart that is such a big theme here in von Hildebrand. Yeah. So, well, then let me. Yeah, please.
I find it really interesting. I'm really not so much into philosophy, but I was just going through your points. You said about not motivated, and you compared that to depression. I really thought that depression was motivated.
Well, yeah. Okay. Good. Well, it's a very thoughtful question. I don't know if it got picked up there by the camera whether depression, which I had mentioned as non-motivated, isn't after all really motivated. And I think an answer in the spirit of von Hildebrand would be that surely there exists both kinds of depression. There exists a caused depression, the one that goes with the hangover, say, that like the euphoria had its causes, so the hangover has its causes. And there are other kinds of so-called organic depression. But then on the other hand, there is, if you want to call that depression, that sense of despondency motivated by some evil that I've understood, some evil oppressing me that I'm aware of. And so then the depression is motivated. So I think von Hildebrand would say that under the name depression, you would sometimes find merely caused affective states, and sometimes find properly motivated ones. It's obviously pretty important that the psychiatrist get that right. If it's motivated and he throws medication at you, he's not helping. On the other hand, if it's not motivated and he enters into elaborate counseling, again, he's missed the mark. So for the fruitful practice of psychological counseling, and psychiatric care, this discrimination between what is motivated and what's merely caused is all important. Well, that maybe leads in another direction for von Hildebrand. It's the existence of motivated affections as an evidence of a region of affections that really belong to us as person and express our existence as persons. Now, here's a third point, a really intriguing point about affectivity. By the way, if this topic interests you, you might look at his book, The Heart. It's a product of the von Hildebrand Legacy Project. Actually, the very first reprint that we produced, The Heart, St. Augustine's Press in South Bend. And it gives a very readable, doesn't require a lot of philosophical training, very readable introduction to his rehabilitation of the heart. Well, in that work, he makes the interesting claim that the heart, in a sense, represents, as he says, the real self of each person. And what he meant was this. I touched on this in the public lecture too, so forgive me if you have some overlap here. But what he meant was a certain contrast with the will. If somebody wills to benefit you, and holds nothing back, is willing to do anything for your good, but is not affectively engaged, takes no delight in you, you don't feel like that the person is really giving himself. He's holding something back. He's not, or she is not fully present in that engagement of the will. There's a full presence of the person that comes only with the affective involvement. And that is a really significant fact. And a person won't feel, a child, you do everything for it, provide for all its needs, spare no sacrifice. But if the child senses there's a resolute, conscientious will at work, but there's no heart taking delight in me as child, then it feels somehow deprived, as if the person holds something back and refuses to be fully present to me. You have to have some feeling with another person in order to be fully present. So that capacity of our affective life to, as it were, awaken and express the real self of the person, that von Hildebrand shows a certain excellence there in the heart, even over against the will, for all of its grandeur as the center of freedom, self-determination. We were talking about the great moral choice in the moral life a little earlier today. So he highly esteems the will, but still he wants to say acting toward another only on the basis of a resolute, benevolent will, no engagement of the heart, is to hold something back and refuse to be fully present to the other. That there's a full presence to the other only possible with the involvement of the heart. And that, he thinks, helps to show the let's say, the eminent personal significance of the heart. And here is one fourth. I said there were four. Here's the fourth that is related to this third one. And it is that for von Hildebrand, love is necessarily an affective relation to the beloved person. Now, of course, also there is a commitment of the will, clearly, to the beloved person. And in every bond of love with another human being, there are moments of affective dryness where the will sustains the relation clearly. But Hildebrand wants to say, if in your relation to another you never take any affective delight in the other, you don't love the other. You may be the supreme benefactor of the other, but love it is not if there isn't some affective delighting in the beloved person. There's a certain warmth of love that requires this affective involvement. And so it's clearly related to the third point. The relation of love to another engages the full, real self of the one who loves. And that is possible only with some feeling for the beloved person. So for von Hildebrand, the argument here in the fourth point is this, that, look, love, we're assuming that is an eminently personal act. That is one of the great achievements of any person, really, to love another. But now look, love is necessarily affective. That shows the ability of our affectivity to be eminently personal. So those are the, let me just go over them, that many affective experiences are motivated, not just caused, that some are real value responses, that in the affective response, the real self of the person is engaged in a way in which it can't be engaged apart from our affective life. And finally, that love is not exclusively, but necessarily also an affective response. So that the significance and dignity of love as a personal act helps to show forth the potential of the human heart. So that is a good part of his brief for the human heart, of his work of trying to rehabilitate the human heart. And I repeat, he is not denying immature, pathological, highly disordered, and so on forms of affectivity. It's just that after all, he makes the good point that at the level of our intellectual life, you have all kinds of pathologies. The statement of Cicero, there is no idea so absurd that some philosopher hasn't defended it. So at the level of intellectual life, you have the highly disordered, the reckless, the bizarre. And yet one still wants to say, but the intellect, that's the crown jewel in human nature. Well, we shouldn't be deterred from seeing the dignity of the heart simply by these disordered forms. Just as the intellect has this wonderful power of understanding, so the heart exists in these eminently personal forms. That's the Hildebrandian idea. that as I say, I reckon that to one of the major contributions of him to philosophy, one of the enduring contributions. Yeah, please, Alan.
Have there been serious philosophical positions taken that assert that love should not involve affect, or that love relations between persons should be impersonal? That's what we're arguing against.
Yeah.
Is there anyone? It's just it's very straightforward.
Yeah.
Something that anyone would agree with.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are many who say, well, you certainly hear it all the time in homilies and sermons. I don't know how it is in the Jewish world, but the sermon opens like this. Now listen, we all tend to think that love is a matter of feeling. Let me tell you, it's a thing of the will. And that playing off of will against the heart is the theme of the discussion of love. That's very common. Now, at the level of philosophers, there are plenty who would take that homiletic theme and, in principle, say it is even. I would say, for the most part, there's an amazing congruence of von Hildebrand with Karol Wojtyła. But Wojtyła, in talking about the place of the will in love, goes much farther than von Hildebrand does, and does not give the heart the same place that von Hildebrand does. So there's a certain difference, at least of emphasis, between those two otherwise so closely kindred spirits. Yeah. Please.
How does von Hildebrand, I don't know if he does address this, but when you think of love of neighbor, and you think of, as Christ said in the gospel, you have to love your enemy. How does Hildebrand say that you're able to love someone that might be doing real harm to you? I mean, take the example of his experience in Vienna when the Nazis were persecuting him. Would he say, well, that you look for something beautiful in that person, and this person is beautiful because they have human dignity, or how did he reconcile that? Because obviously it's easy to love those who are lovable, but I've always thought of love your neighbor as being really an act of the will and
yeah. Well, you could think about the famous example of love of neighbor that Christ gives in the gospel, the Good Samaritan. And I think we have to imagine that the Good Samaritan doesn't just help out of a stern sense of duty, driven by a well-ordered will, but that he must have felt some compassion with the wounded man. There must have been some affective dimension to his care for that person. And Hildebrand would say, and that's an essential part of the concern of the Good Samaritan being real love. If he were a resolute follower, always acts on principle and does the right thing and wills it with the will, but untouched by compassion, it wouldn't count as love of neighbor. So now you bring up the even harder case, though, of the love of enemy. And of course, affective dimension there is usually blocked by the fact that he's trying to hurt you and you have to defend yourself. And so that sort of undermines the situation of any affective delight in that person. But he does sometimes speak of the fact that even a Hitler is a person and has this image of God, and that there's struggle for his soul too, and the desire to see him come to his moral senses. And so I think with the love of enemy, the affective dimension is typically blocked, by the combat situation that you commonly find yourself in. But other forms of love of neighbor, as with the Good Samaritan, I think there it's not hard to find an affective dimension without which wouldn't be the full thing of love. Yeah, Dr. Rice.
Just looking at what you're talking about with love of friendship and love of enemies, if you go to Thomas Aquinas, the love of friendship and love of enemies seems to be something much more objective in terms of the common good that you're aiming at. And one can have an enemy in the family. And one would presume that toward a family member, there would be a deep reservoir of affectivity. So how does one reconcile von Hildebrand's point of view, or does one, with the objectivist point of view that love of enemy and love of friendship are determined objectively according to end, whereas you've got this affective dimension?
I think, to stay with the love of friendship for a moment, friends, for all that you want to say about the objective nature of the friendship and the common goods that unite them, they take delight in each other's company, and if they don't, then it's not quite friendship. So von Hildebrand would argue that, so this affective dimension has its place even next to these objective structures of, say, parental love or love between friends.
Would it be possible to reconcile the two perspectives by pointing out that the affectivity that would be present in what would be called love of enemy would not be an affectivity which would be based on the nucleus of or based on the area of the problem in the relationship, but would be based on something else in the relationship that would be had in common still, despite the disagreement, despite the divergence of ends. And so perhaps we could bring the whole thing back together by distinguishing different levels of affectivity and different levels of directionality in the friendship or the relation.
I think that's certainly if I'm hearing you right, that's not you don't mean that exactly in disagreement with von Hildebrand, but
no, I'm trying to see because I think what von Hildebrand is saying is phenomenologically seems to be correct. Because it seems that that's the way we look at friendships. I'm thinking back to the third person account that Thomas is giving, and I'm wondering how to bring them together, because I don't think they should diverge if they're both correct. And I don't see a reason to doubt von Hildebrand's point of view.
Well, certainly the famous account of friendship that Aristotle gives and that Aquinas builds on it was greatly admired by von Hildebrand. He thought that you could discern between the lines the different dimensions of affectivity that impart a certain warmth to the friendship and are really essential to it, the friendship. I think are we at our break time? I think we should take our usual 15 or so minute break, and we'll get into some issues of von Hildebrand on beauty at the end. Good. All right, well, to the final act here of our little seminar on von Hildebrand. I'm coming to some main ideas of von Hildebrand on beauty, with which we'll close, but two more things on this subject of the heart. Von Hildebrand considers the following objection to his high esteem for the heart. The objection says, look, the affections of a person are not in his or her control. So we often say, I wish I could feel compassion, but I can't. Or you go to condole someone and you feel a little empty because you have the words of condolence, but you don't feel much. And it's really not in your power to summon the feeling. And so the fact that our affective life is not subject to our control and comes and goes, it seems, on its own timeline, that seems to make it perhaps not fully personal. We don't seem really to own it. It seems to befall us and then to leave us, but not really subject to our choice. And so von Hildebrand considers whether that lack of freedom with respect to our deepest affectivity is a sign that it's, after all, something inferior in the person. And he responds with a very intriguing concept that is, again, represents a real contribution of his, and that is the concept of what he calls sanctioning an affection. So it's true, I can't feel compassion on demand. But when it comes, when the compassion arises, I can, as he says, sanction it. That is, I can own it. I can somehow make it my own and put myself there in the position of one who feels compassion, so that it doesn't just befall me and affect me, and so that it's not just something that happens to me. It gets incorporated, you might say, these deep affections into the person through the person's sanctioning. And that sanction, von Hildebrand says, is not an external kind of control, but it's an owning of the affection from within. So that's a rich idea. And he makes the point that to really be alive as person, you can't just let feelings sort of surge over you and come and go, but the well-ordered feelings have to be taken over, owned, sanctioned. Only then have you fully personalized, so to say, your affective life. So that's one idea from his discussion of affectivity that I wanted to mention. And here's one other one. This takes from his book on the nature of love. Now, I've mentioned that for von Hildebrand, love has this intrinsically affective dimension, and you can't have an affectively dead love. The will can't jump in and compensate and make the love to be love. Now, in his treatise on the nature of love, he considers many objections to love, but one in particular that I'd like to bring up and just set you thinking about. It, as I say, seems to me a very fascinating idea in von Hildebrand. Many people say love is blind. There's an American living philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who says, look, love isn't motivated, like people like von Hildebrand say, by some value perceived in the beloved person. Frankfurt says what happens is, first comes love, and then you acquire this illusion of beauty in the beloved person. So the love is blind, it just arises in a blind and erratic way. And then the thought that the beloved person has some goodness or beauty, why, that's a kind of subsequent illusion caused by the love. Now that, if true, would deal quite a blow to the idea that love is motivated it would put seriously in question this, let's say, personal dignity of love. And so von Hildebrand gives attention to this challenge that love is blind, and he gives particular attention to one argument that's often made. People say, look, when you love another person, and somebody asks you, well, why do you love the other person? You're usually at a loss. You really don't have anything very helpful to say why you love this person, especially in connection with the love of friendship or the love between man and woman. And you mention maybe this or that quality, but you somehow know that's not really why I love the other. And so people like Frankfurt say, the reason why you're speechless when asked why you love a person is that there is no reason. Love has no reason. It's irrational. And therefore, after all, not really situated in the life of the person. And von Hildebrand, in his treatise on love, has a very, I think, profound response to that objection. He says, it's true, you and I are at a loss when asked why we love someone, but the reason is not that there's no perceived beauty in the beloved person. The reason is that what we love is always this individual person. We don't just love certain abstract qualities that a person has and shares with many other persons, but what we love is this person in all his or her individuality. And there is, when we love another, a sense that a sense of a beauty proper to this unrepeatable person. That's a real motive for love. That, when seen and experienced, engenders love with all of its affectivity. And the reason why we're at a loss when asked, why do you love, is that the value and beauty in the beloved person is too individual to be uttered. You see, all of our language works with general terms, general concepts. So if we try to say why we love somebody, we mention this and that quality, but other people have that quality too. So why doesn't our love transfer to the others too? No, our love is for this person. And the beauty that awakens the love is a beauty proper to and radiating from this person in all his or her uniqueness. And there is something, as philosophers have long known, something ineffable about the radical individual. Because, as I say, our language works with general terms that can be predicated of many. But when you come to this individual, himself and no other, then our language breaks down and we stammer. But in love, it's not that there's not a real motive of love. It's just that it's ineffable and unutterable, tied up as it is with the individuality of the beloved person. So that theme of loving persons, not because they have some lovable quality that in principle lots of people have, but because they are this unrepeatable person, and this one have a certain beauty all their own. That Hildebrand lets us somehow keep intact the idea that love is motivated by an experienced beauty, even though we are at such a loss when asked to give an account of our love. So that also I wanted to bring in, and there may be something here that is worth discussion before I conclude with something on beauty in Hildebrand. So, he uses the phrase in his treatise on love. He says, when you have another, there is what he calls the full thematicity of the beloved person. That's a phrase difficult to understand at first, but what he means is that the person is present and loved in all his or her individuality. That's this full thematicity. So you don't just take the person as an instance of some lovable quality. Then you begin to lose the individual. If it's a replaceable instance, then your love can wander to other better instances of the same quality. But it's not some communicable quality that founds the love, but this, I think, unrepeatable beauty of this unrepeatable person. And so in that way he harmonizes, as I say, the fully motivated and value-responding character of love with our stammering when asked to account for our love. All right then. I had committed myself to saying something about von Hildebrand on beauty, of the heart, and on beauty. Yes?
I think there's one question about love before we move on, if I may. This is from Samantha, who asked, if we have answers as to why we love another, are we then objectifying the beloved?
Yeah.
So is there something wrong with being able to give a reason?
Well, it's not...
romantic answer.
In principle, if we had the power to utter the concrete individual, then I don't think there would be any objectifying violence done to the person. It's just that it's always that turn to something general and universal when we predicate something of someone. And so the person, in a way, escapes us. But yeah, so I don't think the very idea of giving some utterance to the mystery of a person is unworthy of the person. It's just not available to us human beings with the way our language is tied to general terms. So it seems to me. Now, to the aesthetics of von Hildebrand, as I mentioned, he, in my public lecture, he had, at the end of his life, he was over 80, he had a kind of burst of creative energy and a treatise on aesthetics, on the theory and philosophy of beauty that had been growing in him all his life. He wrote it out by hand, 1,000 pages in typescript, in less than a year. But as I say, it was something fermented in his mind and heart from his earliest years. And so I want to just pick out really one fundamental insight of his regarding beauty, an idea that has a certain fascination to it, and I think will, and it also puts on display the phenomenological orientation of von Hildebrand, of which I spoke in our very first meeting. So, by the way, for a short introduction to the aesthetics, the thought of von Hildebrand on art and beauty, there's no better essay than this one called Beauty in the Light of the Redemption. The essay is not as theological an essay as it may sound to be. It's a primarily philosophical study, and it's one of those writings of his that we have online. Now, in his aesthetics, he makes a fundamental division within the world of beauty. We have, on the one hand, what he calls metaphysical beauty, and on the other hand, what he calls the beauty of visible and audible form. So, beauty, say, of a melody, of a landscape, So let me just explain that distinction and then focus on this intriguing thing that he brought to light with regard to the beauty of visible and audible form. Now, as for the metaphysical beauty, we're already familiar with it because for von Hildebrand, whenever something of value is perceived in its splendor, we have metaphysical beauty. Metaphysical beauty is simply that beauty that exists as the fragrance or radiance of some value in his special sense of value, as explained. So, like the beauty, say, of a noble person. There's first the moral stature, the moral excellence, and as we come to understand that, we also understand a certain splendor that fills us with admiration. And that's metaphysical beauty. This radiance found in connection with everything of value. And there is similarly metaphysical ugliness. So the selfishness of a person, the grasping selfishness, has an ugliness all of its own. Von Hildebrand, in his papers written against Hitler in the 30s, of which I spoke often, speaks of a certain stench of moral evil, capturing the aesthetic radiance of evil, putting all that is good and worthy. There's this radiance of beauty. That's metaphysical beauty. And as I mentioned, let me just mention it again in case you were not at the public lecture, this metaphysical beauty played a tremendous role in von Hildebrand's own conversion. He tells us that it was the supernatural beauty that he discerned in the saints that really fired his imagination and brought on his conversion. And that supernatural beauty, that too is in the order of metaphysical beauty in the sense of his aesthetics. Because obviously the saints weren't like works of art, as if beauty were the main thing about them. They were holy, and in that holiness, though, there was this radiance of beauty. And seeing and feeling that, von Hildebrand was more than by any other factor drawn to his conversion to Catholicism. So one can discern here a connection between this metaphysical beauty and the heart. It was a conversion not of a highly intellectual kind with lots of argument, but one where the heart played a distinct role. Now, that's the one kind of beauty that von Hildebrand discusses in his aesthetics. And then there is, and that's the other one, the beauty of visible and audible form. So, for instance, the beauty, say, of a deer, beauty that, say, a hippopotamus does not in the same way have, or the singing of a nightingale that has a beauty that, the screeching of a braking car doesn't have. So there is with visible and audible form beauty, and not only in art, but also in nature. And this beauty of visible and audible form is different from metaphysical beauty because it's not the radiance of some other value. It's not like with the noble person whose beauty we see and feel. But here the beautiful form has aesthetic value. There's no underlying value, the radiance of which the beauty would be. And this is where we might, more than any place else, tend to speak of aesthetic values. The aesthetic value of visible and audible form is a very natural way of speaking. And it doesn't sound maybe quite right to speak of aesthetic value there with metaphysical value. Now, what I want to show you in von Hildebrand is a certain thought he has about the beauty of visible and audible form, at least about the beauty we sometimes find in certain visible and audible forms. Take say, some glorious sunset, or what they call das Alpenglühen, the Alps glowing in the setting sun. There are settings in nature like this that, when you experience them, leave you speechless. We're in the domain here mainly of visible form, but also a melody of Schubert or Mozart can have an unearthly beauty, and you experience it shuddering mysteriously in yourself in the aesthetic experience. Now, von Hildebrand wants to focus on the beauty of visible and audible form that sometimes has this unearthly grandeur that makes us shudder on experiencing it and draws us upward in a mysterious way. It's a dimension of beauty that's it's not found in every visible and audible form. Like the loveliness of the deer, say, is that's a visible form, but still, nobody would gasp at the unearthly beauty of it. It's somehow naturally proportioned to this animal. But sometimes what is visible in nature or art or audible has an unearthly beauty. And von Hildebrand marvels at the fact that this beauty of certain visible and audible forms so far exceeds, so far transcends the visible and audible form itself. So often we're dealing, like with audible form, just with simple notes. And so, ontologically speaking, it's something very simple. It's not even alive. And yet it can, as he says, be the bearer of this unearthly beauty. And so he marvels at the discrepancy between the visible form and the beauty that we experience in it. It's as if there's no proportion between this unearthly beauty and the modesty of the thing that displays the beauty. You see, with metaphysical beauty, you're never troubled by that disproportion. The radiance is always proportioned to the value of whatever it is that is radiant with beauty. But here, you've got this astonishing disproportion. You have this beauty that seems to exceed altogether the modesty of the bearer of it. I mean, the mountains, the light, those are ontologically modest things, not even alive, as I say. But they form a unity for a moment in which they give off this heart-rending beauty. And Hildebrand is struck by and dwells on the disproportion between the unearthly beauty and the very earthly, ontologically modest character of the bearer of the beauty. And he mentions two wrong-headed ways of thinking philosophically about this beauty. And both of these points, if you recall what we said at the beginning about when Hildebrand is a phenomenologist, I think will strike you as being distinctly phenomenological. So the one mistake that he often saw in authors in aesthetics was this, to say, look, visible and audible forms being something ontologically very plain can't be a source of very great beauty. It's only some modest beauty that is proportioned to them. So there's some illusion here, some misunderstanding. But what is visible and audible being something just of the senses can't be expected to display any very great beauty. And so on this view, the philosopher tries to talk us out of our sense of this excess of beauty in these cases. The other approach that Hildebrand deals with is basically the attempt to take this unearthly beauty of the visible and audible and press it into the paradigm of metaphysical beauty. So here one says that when we see, let's say, the majestic mountain, he quotes an author who held this, it reminds you, the author says, of the immensity of God. And that's what is behind the unearthly beauty. So one tries to connect the visible and audible form with something of great metaphysical significance and say, the beauty is, after all, understandable, like all metaphysical beauty, as the radiance of that great metaphysical reality. And it's interesting that Von Hildebrand, deeply religious man, deeply religious writer as he was, rejects that theory. He says, it's just not in your and my experience of, let's say, the unearthly beauty of a Mozart melody, that we're making some connection with some divine reality and thereby getting the beauty. You don't even have to be a believer, after all, to listen to Mozart and be moved by it. So he thinks that this is an artificial construction. This is a typically unphenomenological move of taking a phenomenon and pressing it into a foreign paradigm. This is not metaphysical beauty. The aesthetic experience here tells us that the beauty appears on this modest, sensible reality, something seen or heard, but has this mysterious grandeur and fills us, like Wordsworth says, with intimations of immortality. And so he insists there's a discrepancy here. Don't try to paper that over. A mysterious discrepancy between the grandeur of the beauty and the modesty of the bearer of the beauty. And so he uses this analogy. He says it's as if certain visible and audible forms are capable of functioning like a pedestal on which something else rests. You see, when you've got the pedestal, well, the statue on it is not just the effluence of the pedestal. It's something entirely different placed there on the pedestal. And so it's as if these visible and audible forms become mysteriously, who knows why, for a moment, a pedestal on which something from above appears and moves us. But of course, as soon as the light changes or if the melody is distorted a little, the aesthetic power is completely dissipated. He even makes, and maybe that's a more interesting analogy to the sacraments in the Christian sense, that just as water, a very plain earthly substance, is connected with this mysterious power of baptismal regeneration in the Christian understanding of baptism, so these visible and earthly forms, in a somewhat similar way, are for a moment invested with a power that far exceeds their natural makeup. But it's in the end, von Hildebrand leaves this subject in mystery. He doesn't try to solve it or import a theological interpretation. He lets stand this mystery of the mysterious momentary eruption of something, as it were, from another world in the beautiful object. And he also is very sharp against a kind of puritanical religion that says, look, we're religiously serious people. We're not going to lose too much time with beautiful, audible, and visible forms. That's self-indulgent. We're serious believers and have no need of that. And Hildebrand thinks this beauty of visible and audible form has, after all, a very great claim on the heart of the believer, that it is something to be cherished and not puritanically disparaged. So that, in a very compressed fashion, is what he himself regarded as the most important single idea in his long treatise on aesthetics. And it fills a number of chapters there, and I'm giving it to you in its simplest terms. But it is, so we have the metaphysical beauty on the one side, where the beauty is always understandably proportioned to its bearer and to the value of it, and then this beauty of some visible and audible forms, where I find this disproportion or disparity between bearer and beauty, and can only wonder at what it is that capacitates certain visible and audible forms to all of a sudden, for a moment, reach so far beyond themselves. So, that certainly must give us something for discussion here at the end. I don't know, Christopher, if you've got online.
I think they're all processing it because this,
Okay.
this is pretty new, right?
Yes.
So no one would have been able to.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do actually have an interesting question from Hans on this, asking how this relates, if you could maybe briefly, how this relates to Kant's beauty versus the Kant's distinction between beauty and the sublime.
Yes, yeah.
Is that, does that map onto Hildebrand's distinction?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think, the sublime in Kant has certainly some real affinity with this special beauty of visible and audible form. I don't know that Kant works out quite this disparity between bearer and beauty like von Hildebrand does, but this kinship, some real kinship of spirit with Immanuel Kant's idea of the sublime that he distinguishes from beauty.
Is that in the fact that the sublime is ultimately sort of a moral beauty, or rests on morals, and then in Hildebrand, and metaphysical beauty is again this sort of I don't know, I wouldn't say moral, but
Is the beauty of visible and audible form for von Hildebrand is not immoral beauty. It's somehow akin, to the metaphysical beauty of moral greatness, but it's and we see it in the aesthetic experience. It's not exactly an experience of moral greatness. There's a very deliberate restraint that von Hildebrand practices in bringing to evidence this disparity and letting it stand, but stressing what he calls a certain sursum corda, or an uplifting of the heart that, as it were, transports us by an intimation of another world. Yeah, please.
So is this unearthly beauty subjective in the sense that at different times we could be affected by this great work of music in a certain way, or this scenery in a certain way, and also some people might not have the same reactions? But could we say that even though it's subjective, that it is transcendent, because when we do have that response, it moves us beyond?
I think Rand maybe would, he was a defender of objective good, objective beauty, objective morality. And here too, I think he would say, whoever hears, let's say, one of those Mozart melodies. I heard there with the Pittsburgh Symphony just a couple of weeks ago, this clarinet concerto, the Adagio in that piece of music, which is certainly Mozart at is one of those heavenly inspirations of Mozart. And so von Hildebrand, I think, would say whoever hears such a piece of music rightly, really taking in what's there, will experience this. It's not just totally erratic, that one person feels it with a garbage heap and another feels it with Mozart, and who knows. No, there's a certain objective power of certain audible forms to do what other audible forms can't do. And whoever hears it truly and with real aesthetic understanding will find it in the same place. But he does say there's something ununderstandable about why exactly these notes in this melody are so unutterably beautiful, and why slightly changed they become plain. That he somehow respects as ununderstandable. Yeah.
So again, we have this distinction between metaphysical beauty and the beauty of the visual and the audible forms. Is it the case then for von Hildebrand that people who are blind or deaf have no access to this latter type of beauty?
Yeah, well, depends. If they become deaf later in life, like Beethoven, they may still have it. But you know, a person born deaf would have no access. No, that clearly follows. Or born blind have no access to that beauty of visible form. Yeah, that
And so would it
that
have
follows.
to be the case, going back to some of our earlier discussions in the week, that that beauty and appreciating that value really is not essential to, you know, being a moral person, and it's sort of
Yeah.
a bonus, if you will.
Yes, right. No. It may be that through no fault of your own, you're cut off from this beauty. And the blind and deaf person may have a sense of various kinds of metaphysical beauty, the kindness of people who help them. They're in a position to experience that kindness, its moral value, and its distinct beauty. But the beauty of visible and audible form would not be available to them. As it were, accentuating the cross that goes with being deaf or blind. Yeah, please.
The beauty of these material forms would be perceived by the heart as you fall in love with the uniqueness of a person.
Yeah.
Like, if that's the case, let's say we don't need to be intellectually trained
Yes.
to appreciate
Oh.
the beauty of something that is truly beautiful.
Oh, that's right. No, yeah, that's certainly true. That this experience of the beauty of visible and audible form, especially of this particularly potent beauty, is very much an experience with the heart. It's not. It doesn't involve intellectual operations, and high intelligence are no great help, but it's aesthetic sensibility and a certain responsiveness of the heart that lets one experience this beauty.
I'm coming to the contemporary belief that, for example, you are not able to appreciate the beauty of the piece of art because you haven't been educated sufficiently, or to understand that would be false, because true beauty would be evident to anyone, especially like this supernatural kind of beauty.
Certainly, the beauty in nature, the grandeur of the sunset or the starry sky that Kant so marveled at, that doesn't require any education. It just requires an awakened human heart. It may be that the wrong kind of education is a liability for really experiencing the beauty of the world. But this is why I put together in today's meeting the theme of the heart and beauty, because these experiences, these aesthetic experiences that with this mysterious transcendence to them that he describes are there's a certain susceptibility of the heart, which is far more at work than any acuity of the intellect. Yes?
I have another follow-up question about this. Why does he limit it just to the visible and the audible, and not like the scent of a rose?
Yes, right.
Anything of the sort?
Yes, right. Well, he does acknowledge that certain aromas, especially in conjunction with visible form, can be a certain enhancement. Now, there's not only visible and audible, but also, the aromatic can have definite aesthetic qualities. But I think he thinks that when it comes to this, let's just say, unearthly beauty, it is above all the visible and audible that provide the basis, the mysterious basis for it. That's already in Plato's, that these two senses of seeing and hearing have a special affinity with beauty. Yeah, yes, please, Brad. Excuse me.
I think kind of going on what you're saying earlier, sometimes it's hard to, I guess in a sense, argue with those who want to uphold really perverse forms of art as something beautiful.
Yeah.
I would argue so just out of their,
Yeah.
I feel it is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a very kind of
Yeah.
kind of thing to say, but
Yeah.
there is kind of a seeping
Yeah.
into of morality into these visible and audible forms. It really seems like once you kind of really disconnect it, you kind of it becomes very difficult to argue that those might say.
Well, I think what you find more with certain kinds of avant-garde art is not so much the claim that something is beautiful that you don't find beautiful, but that the aesthetic excellence of it doesn't have anything to do with beauty. That's a very widespread position. Some artists don't even want beauty. They think it's, bourgeois corruption, beauty. So they want energy, they want, challenge, they want shock effect, but it's other aesthetic qualities than beauty. So the debate is more fundamental, over beauty, but whether art really should be centrally tied to beauty.
Does he have any definition of what art is?
Well, in his view of
standard of what you can actually call art.
In his view, it centers primarily around the beautiful, and he doesn't enter in. That would be an interesting development of von Hildebrand. He doesn't enter into debate with those who want art which speaks completely apart from beauty. That he would have had little sympathy for, but it would take further work on his basis to deal with that situation in the contemporary art world. Yeah.
I have all kinds of good questions coming in now.
And we're almost at the end of the
it's true, but I have to know, does von Hildebrand in the aesthetics give any sort of guidelines on doing a phenomenological aesthetics? And even so that we can do it ourselves, even have our own phenomenological aesthetic appreciation. Is there a method for that?
Method? Well,
Right.
I don't.
I guess I would ask, is it in any way distinct from the phenomenological method employed throughout the rest of the corpus?
No, I think he would just say here too, back to the things themselves, back to the primary sources of experience. He would make the point with aesthetics that you shouldn't really get into aesthetics if you don't have some lived experience of art and beauty. You've got to bring to this branch of philosophy some more than abstract sense of art and beauty. Otherwise, you can't fruitfully philosophize. You lack the basis and experience for doing fruitful work in aesthetics. So, that famous passage in Rudolf Otto where he begins by saying, I ask the reader to make present some experience of the holy, and if the reader can't, he should put this book down. It has nothing to say to him. So there's certain experiences you've got to bring to certain areas of philosophy in order to think fruitfully. And so here in aesthetics, one needs to have a living relation to art and beauty and nature in order to have something significant to say. Yes?
could this be extended to something beyond this experience, beyond art and music? And the reason why I say it is because I never quite understood Edna St. Vincent's Millay's poem, Euclid alone has looked on Beauty Bare. So I don't know, she's using something else besides art and music, which doesn't quite make sense to me, but is it possible? Am I missing something?
Beauty in geometry.
Geometry.
Yes. Yeah, well, philosophers have often talked about the beauty of the circle. And so...
that doesn't seem quite to be the same as Mozart.
Yeah. No, it's not. It isn't exactly this unearthly beauty, but Hildebrand, I think, would acknowledge a certain aesthetic quality that over and above all the properties that Euclid explores, there's certain aesthetic excellences and even a certain beauty in such a shape. But to say Euclid alone has done it,
That's what she said.
that's a stretch. Of course, then you may bring up all the mathematical basis of music and throw a different light on
So
that.
the race, beauty, I'm
Yes.
worried about the mathematics.
Yeah. Let's see. All right, please. We're not going to cut off urgent questions.
Does he tie in any way aesthetics and morals? Like when he said, you know, you can have subjective satisfaction in destruction of the good. You could translate that in destruction of the beautiful.
Yes.
And it would be still subjective, or is an objective thing? He connects in any way beauty with good, or is doesn't enter in this kind of discussion?
Beauty with good?
Yes,
Yeah,
with
yes.
assigns a moral
Well,
dimension to the search for the
well,
beautiful.
He does. No, he does. Connected in the sense that this fundamental moral virtue of reverence that we've talked about again and again in these three meetings, reverence, he thinks, is very important to really perceiving beauty fully. Now, other things too, moral and aesthetic sensibility that a person may, through no fault of their own, lack. But when the aesthetic equipment is there in a person, it takes also this reverence. In other words, the world of the beautiful is a region in this world of value, in the sense of Hildebrand. And reverence is all important for appreciating it, as it is in general for experiencing value. It's certainly what he thought. Please.
What is his thoughts between beauty and time? As in one time, a period in your life where you look at an object and it looks a certain way, and then or a person for that matter.
Well, he sometimes remarks on certain moments of susceptibility, where the beauty of a thing really fills you and fascinates you. And other moments, perhaps, when it's hardly accessible to you. But for him, you have a subjectivity more on the side of the human experiencer, not exactly on the side of beauty itself. He would say that even metaphysical beauty, can be more strongly experienced at one time, and at another time you feel like you've got no access to it at all. No states of depression can completely cancel out the aesthetic sensibility. And so that susceptibility to beauty at different times is certainly acknowledged by him. And obviously there's a point where early on a child doesn't maybe recognize beauty or hasn't developed an ear for music, and then does. But that's not the child investing the thing with beauty, but becoming alive to a beauty that it, first of all, couldn't hear.
It seems like kind of a connection with what you said the first day. For example, in music, or in sound in general, you need time to perceive.
Yeah.
Music, you listen to, it takes 10 minutes to listen to
Yeah.
movement or something like that. Time is part of the very phenomenological experience of
Right, yeah.
perceiving
Yes, right. With music, the thing is situated in time and unfolds in time. But then you bring up the other dimension of time, where the whole temporal object is at one moment in my life accessible and at another not accessible. Yeah. What else? Christopher, we could take one more.
I don't think I have any others right now. We've been having some discussions about this phenomenological method. So if you do have any more insight on that, it has generated a fruitful discussion here.
Good.
Let
me conclude by saying this, that the Legacy Project has produced various translations of Von Hildebrand. It's projecting more, but right at this moment, we are in the midst of translating his treatise on aesthetics, all 1,000 pages of it. Christopher himself was helping last summer with that, and we hope that within a year or two that will be published and available to in English. Yes, we're translating it from German into English. So
for the first time,
and
it's never been
translated before, and it's really a hidden treasure, and we're making it accessible by getting it into English, and you can find out about that translation and its publication through the website of the Legacy Project. That is in the making right now.
Are all of his work still under copyright?
No. Many of the German copyrights have lapsed, and
Then
so
have they been loaded on Project Gutenberg? Do you know?
that I don't know. I'd have to check with my son, or maybe Christopher.
I can answer this. We're in the process. So a lot of them are out of copyright, or we have the copyrights, or we're in the process of acquiring the copyrights. We are, as John and you mentioned, working right now on digitizing all of these, making them searchable so they'll be available online. There are some that are still in print, for which we do not have the copyright. We're hoping to be able to get those, perhaps. We may or may not. But the bulk of his works, both in English and shortly thereafter in German, should be available. We're hoping very ambitiously to accomplish this by the fall. Begin rolling these out, and then every few months roll out a few more. So, whereas right now there really is, we have many more books now available than there were a few years ago. Mm-hmm. There's so many more that are very hard to find. That should happen soon.
That's right. Yeah, we have very ambitious publication plans that
it is ambitious.
We will be hearing about if you get our emails and follow the website. Well, I think with that we are at the end, and even a little over the end of the period. So I just thank you all for your participation, your interest. That has been a very rewarding experience for me to share all of this with you. And maybe we can, in some other setting, continue it in the future. So thank you all.